Elena Rivera wiped down table 7 for the third time that evening, her reflection barely visible in the polished mahogany surface. The restaurant was called La Scala, one of those places where a single appetizer could cost more than she made in a night. She'd been working there for 3 years now, and somewhere along the way she'd stopped being a person to most of the customers. She was just part of the scenery, like the crystal chandeliers or the silk curtains that probably cost more than her car. 28 years old, and this wasn't where she thought she'd be. But life has a funny way of rewriting your plans when you're not looking. Elena had been someone once, or at least she was on her way to becoming someone. She'd spent 5 years at the Western Conservatory of Music, one of the best music schools in the country. Her professors told her she had something special, that rare combination of technical skill and emotional depth that separated good pianists from great ones. But then her mom got sick. Really sick. The kind of sick where medical bills start arriving faster than you can open them, where the word treatment becomes just another way of saying expensive. Elena had been in her final year, just months away from graduating when she made the choice. Actually, it didn't feel like a choice at all. It felt like the only thing she could do. She dropped out, moved back home, and started working. First at a diner, then at La Scala when a position opened up. The pay was better at the fancy restaurant, even if the customers treated her worse. Rich people had a way of looking right through you, like you were made of glass, or maybe like you weren't there at all. Every single night, Elena walked past the grand piano that sat in the corner of the main dining room. It was a beautiful instrument, a Steinway that probably cost as much as a house. The owners kept it perfectly maintained, polished until it gleamed under the soft amber lighting. But nobody ever played it. It was just there for decoration, to make the place look more sophisticated, more cultured. That piano haunted her. Every time she passed it carrying a tray of overpriced food, her fingers would twitch. Muscle memory is a strange thing. Even after 3 years of not playing seriously, her hands remembered. They remembered the weight of the keys, the stretch required for those big Rachmaninoff chords, the delicate touch needed for Debussy. Sometimes, late at night after her shift ended and she was lying in bed too tired to sleep, she could still feel phantom melodies running through her fingers. The worst part wasn't the giving up of her dream. She'd made peace with that, mostly. Her mom was stable now, the treatment was working, and that's what mattered. The worst part was how quickly the world forgot you existed. She used to get emails from her professors, check-ins from classmates, invitations to performances. But after a year of silence, they stopped. People moved on. Her old life closed up behind her like water, leaving no trace that she'd ever been part of it. Elena had student loans from those 5 unfinished years, a monthly payment that felt like an anchor tied around her neck. She was paying for an education she never completed, for a future that never happened. Sometimes she wondered what the point of it all was. All those hours practicing scales, memorizing complicated pieces, studying music theory until her eyes crossed. What good was any of that knowledge when you spent your days asking people if they wanted sparkling or still water? Her coworker, Miguel, was the only person at the restaurant who knew about her background. She'd told him one night after a particularly brutal shift, when a customer had literally snapped his fingers at her like she was a dog. Miguel played guitar in a band on weekends and understood what it meant to have music in your blood. "You should play it sometime," he'd said, nodding toward the piano. After hours when nobody's here, she'd thought about it. More than once she'd stayed late, finishing up her side work slowly, lingering near that piano. But she could never quite bring herself to sit down at the bench. What if her fingers didn't remember? What if 3 years had eroded whatever skill she'd built up? What if playing again hurt worse than not playing at all? Besides, the restaurant had strict rules. The staff wasn't allowed to touch the piano. It was for professional entertainers only, though they rarely hired any. The owner, Mr. Castellano, had made it clear when she was hired that the boundary between staff and guests was sacred. They served, the guests were served. That was the natural order of things in his establishment, so Elena kept serving. She smiled when she needed to smile, stayed invisible when that was better. She memorized regular customers' orders and laughed at jokes that weren't funny. She worked double shifts when she could, saving money for her mom's prescriptions and chipping away at those loan payments one painful dollar at a time. But at night, she dreamed in music. She'd wake up with pieces playing in her head, complicated passages that her sleeping mind performed perfectly. Sometimes she'd dream she was back at the conservatory, in one of the practice rooms with the late afternoon sun coming through the windows. Those dreams were beautiful and terrible at the same time, because waking up from them meant remembering everything she'd lost. Her mom knew what the sacrifice had cost her. They'd had conversations about it. Late-night talks where her mom cried and said Elena should go back, finish her degree. But the math didn't work. Even with her mom doing better, the medical bills hadn't stopped. Insurance covered some things, but not everything, and the co-pays alone were crushing. Going back to school meant stopping work, and stopping work meant everything would fall apart. "You were so good, mija," her mom would say, using the Spanish endearment that made Elena feel like a child again. "You still are good. That doesn't just disappear." But Elena wasn't sure about that. Skill was like a muscle, and she hadn't exercised hers in years. She'd probably forgotten half of her repertoire by now. Her technique had probably deteriorated. She'd read somewhere that professional pianists needed to practice for hours every day just to maintain their level. She hadn't done that in 3 years. Still, the piano called to her. Every single shift, that silent instrument in the corner seemed to be waiting. Sometimes when the restaurant was quiet and she was setting up for the evening service, she'd find herself standing next to it, close enough to see her distorted reflection in the polished black surface, close enough to imagine what it would feel like to play again. She never imagined that soon. She wouldn't have a choice. That circumstances would push her toward that piano in a way she couldn't resist. That one night, everything would change, and the careful, quiet life she'd built would crack wide open, exposing both her greatest vulnerability and her greatest strength. But that night was coming. It was already circled on the calendar in Mr. Castellano's office, marked as a big private party that would bring in wealthy guests and generous tips. Elena had no idea that this party would become the most important night of her life, the moment when 3 years of hiding would finally end. For now, though she just wiped down tables and stayed invisible, walking past that piano dozens of times a night, her fingers twitching with phantom music that nobody else could hear. The Saturday of the Henderson party arrived with the kind of chaos that made even experienced staff nervous. Elena had worked plenty of private events at La Scala, but this one was different. The Hendersons were old money, the kind of family that had buildings named after them at universities. Their daughter Christine was getting engaged to some tech entrepreneur, and they'd rented out the entire restaurant for the evening. Mr. Castellano had been stressed for weeks leading up to it. Everything had to be perfect. The flower arrangements alone probably cost more than Elena's monthly rent. Ice sculptures shaped like swans sat on every other table. The chef had designed a special tasting menu with ingredients flown in from 3 different continents. This was the kind of event that could make or break a restaurant's reputation with the wealthy crowd. Elena arrived early for her shift, wearing the formal black and white uniform required for special events. The other servers were already there, moving with the kind of precise urgency that comes before a big night. Miguel caught her eye and made a face that said, "Here we go." "Did you hear they hired Gerald Hutchinson?" whispered Lisa, another server, as they set up the tables. "You know, the pianist who plays at all the symphony fundraisers?" Elena had heard of him. Everyone in the classical music world knew Gerald Hutchinson, though his reputation was complicated. Brilliant technical skills, but a personality that matched his ego. And lately, there'd been rumors about him showing up to events drunk, though people in high society tended to overlook such things if you were talented enough. The guests started arriving at 7. Elena watched them sweep in. Women in dresses that cost more than her car. Men in suits tailored so perfectly they looked painted on. They air-kissed each other and laughed those practiced laughs that rich people seem to learn somewhere. Christine Henderson held court in the center, showing off her enormous engagement ring to anyone who'd look. Elena's job for the night was simple in theory, complicated in practice: be invisible but attentive, present but not intrusive, serve without being seen. She'd gotten good at it over 3 years. That particular dance of existing and not existing at the same time. 8 o'clock came and went. No pianist. Mr. Castellano kept checking his phone, his face getting redder by the minute. The guests were getting restless, drinking their expensive cocktails and asking when the entertainment would start. At 8:30, Gerald Hutchinson finally stumbled through the door, and even from across the room, Elena could tell something was wrong. He was drunk. Not tipsy, not slightly buzzed, but seriously, obviously intoxicated. His bow tie was crooked, his hair was a mess, and he had to steady himself against the door frame as he entered. Mr. Castellano rushed over, trying to quietly usher him toward the piano, probably hoping to get him seated before too many guests noticed. But they noticed. They always notice things like that. Elena watched the whispers spread through the crowd like ripples in water. Christine Henderson's smile froze on her face. Her father, a stern man named Richard, who probably hadn't been told no in 30 years, looked like he might explode. Gerald made it to the piano bench and launched into his first piece, something by Mozart. It should have been beautiful. Instead, it was a disaster. His fingers stumbled over notes, the timing was completely off, and halfway through he actually stopped and started over. The room went from uncomfortable to mortified. People started talking louder, trying to cover the awkward performance with conversation. After the second piece, which was somehow even worse than the first, Gerald attempted to introduce the next selection. His words were slurred, his sentences trailing off halfway through thoughts. That's when Mr. Castellano made the decision. Elena watched him walk purposefully to the piano, lean down, and whisper something to Gerald. The pianist's face went red, but he stood up, swaying slightly. The manager escorted him out through the kitchen door. The room erupted. Christine Henderson was furious, her voice carrying across the restaurant as she complained about the incompetent staff and ruined evening. Her father demanded to speak to Mr. Castellano immediately. Other guests chimed in, some sympathetic, others joining the criticism. Elena, carrying a tray of champagne flutes, felt every word like a slap. It wasn't her fault, wasn't any of their fault, but that didn't matter. They were the staff, and something had gone wrong, so they were to blame. Mr. Castellano was making frantic phone calls, trying to find a replacement pianist. But it was Saturday night, short notice, and every professional musician in the city was already booked. Elena watched him pace near the kitchen, phone pressed to his ear, desperation written across his face. Richard Henderson's voice boomed across the room. "I'll pay $1,000 to anyone who can salvage this disaster. Surely someone here can play piano." The number hit Elena like electricity. $1,000. That was 2 months of her mom's medication. That was a serious dent in her student loans. That was breathing room, the kind she hadn't had in 3 years, but she hadn't played seriously in so long. And these people? They expected perfection. They'd just watched a professional pianist, even drunk, and found him wanting. What would they think of a waitress who hadn't touched a piano in years? Her hands were shaking as she set down the tray. She could feel the piano across the room, that instrument she'd walked past 1,000 times. Her fingers remembered things her brain had tried to forget. Rachmaninoff's Second Piano Concerto, Chopin's Nocturnes, Gershwin's Rhapsody in Blue. They were still there, buried under 3 years of serving food and staying invisible. Miguel appeared beside her. "You okay? You look pale." "I could do it," she whispered so quietly she almost didn't hear herself. "What?" "I could play. I mean, I used to. Before." Miguel's eyes went wide. "Elena, are you serious? That's $1,000. "I know. But I haven't played in years. What if I'm terrible? What if I embarrass myself worse than the drunk guy?" "What if you're not terrible?" Miguel countered. "Look, worst case scenario, you try and it doesn't work. Best case, you save the night and get $1,000. Elena looked at the piano again, then at the guests who were getting more agitated by the minute, then at Mr. Castellano, who looked like he might cry. She thought about her mom at home, about those medical bills, about the student loans for a degree she never finished. She walked toward Mr. Castellano before she could change her mind. Her legs felt like they belonged to someone else. "Excuse me, Mr. Castellano?" He looked at her, distracted, phone still in hand. "Not now, Elena. I'm dealing with a crisis." "I know, sir. That's why I'm here. I can play piano. I studied at the Western Conservatory for 5 years. I could fill in if you need someone." He stared at her like she'd just spoken a foreign language. "You? You're a pianist?" "I was. I mean, I am. I just haven't played in a... Well, but I know a lot of pieces and... How long is a while? 3 years, sir. His face fell. 3 years might as well have been forever in his world. But then he looked at the room full of angry, wealthy guests, at the empty piano bench, at his phone with no solutions on the other end. Fine, he said, the word coming out like a sigh. Fine. It's better than nothing. But Elena, if you make this worse, I understand. She walked toward the piano, and it felt like walking through water. Every step took forever. She was aware of eyes turning toward her, the waitress in her black and white uniform crossing the room toward the grand piano. She heard someone laugh, a sharp mocking sound that cut through the conversation. Are you kidding me? Christine Henderson's voice rang out. Now the help is going to entertain us? This is beyond ridiculous. Someone else said, Is this a joke? Did someone hire a comedian? Elena's face burned. She almost turned around, almost ran back to the kitchen and hid. But then she thought about her mom, about the conservatory, about all those dreams that got buried under medical bills and survival. She thought about 3 years of walking past this piano, 3 years of silent music playing in her head. She sat down at the bench. The position felt foreign and familiar at the same time, like coming home after a long absence and finding everything slightly different than you remembered. She adjusted the bench height, a movement her body remembered even if her mind had forgotten. Her fingers hovered over the keys. The room was talking now, some people still complaining, others curious about what would happen next. She heard Christine say something else, something mean that got swallowed by the noise. Mr. Castellano stood to the side, looking like he was praying. Elena closed her eyes. She thought about her first piano teacher, Mrs. Chen, who'd told her that music wasn't about the notes on the page. It was about the story you were trying to tell. She thought about her mom, who'd driven her to lessons twice a week for 10 years without ever complaining. She thought about all those practice room hours at the conservatory, the sound of other students playing in adjacent rooms, the particular smell of old wood and determination. She placed her hands on the keys. After 3 years of silence, it was time to remember who she used to be. Elena's hands were trembling as they rested on the keys. Not from nervousness alone, though there was plenty of that. They were trembling from recognition, from the sudden rush of memory that came from touching an instrument after 3 years of forced separation. The keys felt cool under her fingertips, smooth and familiar, like shaking hands with an old friend you'd lost touch with. The room hadn't quieted down. In fact, the laughter and comments seemed to be getting louder. Someone near the back made a joke about calling a real pianist, and several people laughed. Elena could feel Christine Henderson's glare burning into the side of her face. Mr. Castellano stood frozen by the kitchen door, looking like he was calculating how badly this could damage his restaurant's reputation. Miguel gave her a small nod from across the room, and that tiny gesture of support meant everything. Just one person who believed she could do this, or at least one person who wasn't actively hoping she'd fail. Elena had to choose what to play. That decision felt enormous in the moment. These people expected something impressive, something worthy of the fancy setting and their expensive expectations, but she also knew her limitations. It had been 3 years. Her fingers might not be able to handle the most technically demanding pieces anymore. She decided on Debussy's Clair de Lune. It was a piece she'd loved since childhood, one she'd played hundreds of times at the conservatory. It was beautiful without being showy, emotional without being overdramatic. Most importantly, her hands remembered it in a way that went deeper than conscious thought. She could feel the melody living somewhere in her muscle memory, waiting to be released. The first note silenced the room. It wasn't magic exactly. It was just a single note, played with the right touch, the right weight, the right intention. But in that expensive restaurant full of cynical, wealthy people who'd been laughing at her seconds before, that one note cut through the noise like a knife through silk. Elena didn't have time to process the sudden quiet. Her training kicked in, and her hands moved through the opening measures of the piece. Those first few phrases were tentative, her fingers relearning the geography of the keys, her mind reconnecting with muscles that had been dormant for too long. But with each measure, something started to happen. The rust fell away. The distance collapsed. She wasn't a waitress anymore, wasn't a dropout with student loans and medical bills and crushed dreams. She was just a pianist, doing what she'd been trained to do. The sound that came from the Steinway was breathtaking. The restaurant's acoustics were perfect, designed to showcase performances exactly like this. Every note bloomed in the space, clear and resonant. Elena had forgotten what it felt like to play on an instrument this good. The pianos at the conservatory had been fine, well-maintained but well-used. This was different. This piano responded to the slightest change in pressure, the smallest shift in intention. As she moved deeper into the piece, Elena's awareness of the room began to fade. This was something her old teacher had called the zone, that state where the music took over and everything else disappeared. Her fingers found their confidence, moving across the keys with increasing certainty. The tentative feeling from the opening was gone, replaced by something stronger, surer. She could hear her conservatory professors in her head, their voices offering guidance she'd internalized years ago. Let the melody sing, Elena. Support the bass line. Think about the harmonic movement, where each phrase is going. Their lessons had become part of her, and even after 3 years of silence, they were still there. The piece built toward its emotional climax, that moment where Debussy's harmonies create something almost unbearably beautiful. Elena leaned into it, letting the dynamics swell, giving each chord time to resonate before moving to the next. This was the part that always made her mother cry when she played it at home, back before everything fell apart. Thinking about her mom brought unexpected emotion into her playing. All the fear and exhaustion of the past 3 years, all the sacrifices and compromises and small deaths of hope, it all came pouring out through her fingers. She wasn't just playing Debussy anymore. She was telling her own story, one she hadn't been able to tell anyone, not even herself. The room stayed silent. Elena was too focused on the music to notice, but if she'd looked up, she would have seen something remarkable. Christine Henderson, who'd been so cruel just minutes earlier, stood perfectly still, her champagne glass forgotten in her hand. Richard Henderson's stern expression had softened into something like wonder. The other guests had stopped their conversations, stopped their complaints, stopped everything. They were listening. Elena transitioned into the final section of the piece where the melody returns but quieter, more introspective. Her touch on the keys became delicate, almost whispered. This was the hardest part to play, requiring more control than all the dramatic sections combined. But her hands remembered. They knew exactly how much weight to use, how to make the notes float rather than strike. The last chord faded into silence. Helena held her hands on the keys for a moment, the way she'd been taught, letting the resonance die naturally rather than lifting her fingers too quickly. Then she sat back and suddenly remembered where she was. The applause started slowly, just 1 or 2 people, then spread through the room like wildfire. Within seconds, every person in the restaurant was clapping. Some were on their feet. Elena blinked, disoriented, emerging from the zone and crashing back into reality. She looked up and saw faces she didn't recognize staring at her with expressions she couldn't quite parse. Shock, admiration. She'd been invisible to these people all night, just the waitress bringing their food. Now they were looking at her like they were seeing her for the first time. Mr. Castellano was applauding too, his face a mixture of relief and amazement. Miguel was grinning like crazy from his position near the kitchen. Even the chef had come out to watch, standing in the doorway with his arms crossed but a smile on his face. That was... Richard Henderson started speaking but seemed to lose the words. That was extraordinary. Young lady, where did you learn to play like that? Elena's mouth felt dry. She'd performed plenty of times at the conservatory, but never in front of an audience like this. Never in front of people who'd been mocking her seconds before she sat down. I studied at the Western Conservatory, sir, she managed to say. Her voice sounded strange to her own ears. Western Conservatory? A woman in a silver dress leaned forward. That's one of the best music schools in the country. Why are you working as a waitress? The question felt like a punch to the gut, even though the woman probably didn't mean it that way. Why was she working as a waitress? Because life happened. Because her mom got sick. Because medical bills didn't care about dreams or talent or potential. Because sometimes you had to give up everything you wanted to take care of the people you loved. Life circumstances, Elena said simply, hoping they wouldn't push for details. But Christine Henderson, whose engagement party this was supposed to be, stepped forward. Her face looked different than it had before. The cruelty was gone, replaced by something softer. Were those tears on her cheeks? "That was the most beautiful thing I've ever heard," Christine said quietly. "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry for what I said before. I was awful to you." Elena didn't know what to say to that. An apology from someone like Christine Henderson felt surreal. Impossible, even. "Could you play something else?" Richard Henderson asked. "Please. That $1,000 I mentioned. It's yours regardless, but would you consider playing a few more pieces? This party needs music, and I can't imagine anyone better to provide it than you." $1,000. Elena had almost forgotten about that in the intensity of playing. $1,000 for doing the thing she loved most in the world. For the first time in 3 years, those two parts of her life, the music and the money, didn't have to be in opposition. But she was nervous now. Claire de Lune had been safe. A piece so deeply embedded in her muscle memory that she could probably play it in her sleep. What else did she remember well enough to perform? What if the next piece didn't go as smoothly? What if her luck ran out? Then she looked at the piano, at her hands still resting on the keys, and felt something click into place. This wasn't about luck. This was about who she was, who she'd always been underneath the uniform and the student loans and the weight of responsibility. She was a pianist. That hadn't changed even when everything else had. "Yes," she heard herself say, "I can play more." The room erupted in applause again, and Elena allowed herself a small smile. She thought about what to play next. Something different from Debussy, something that would show range. Her mind flickered through her old repertoire, pieces she'd studied and performed and loved. Gershwin, she decided. Rhapsody in Blue. It was ambitious, maybe too ambitious given how long it had been, but it was also thrilling and jazzy and unexpected. These people expected classical music from someone with her background. She'd give them something that would surprise them. She adjusted her position on the bench, rolled her shoulders once to release tension, and placed her hands back on the keys. The opening glissando of Rhapsody in Blue required confidence, a bold upward sweep that announced itself without apology. Elena took a breath and began to play. The opening glissando of Rhapsody in Blue rang out like a challenge, that iconic sweeping run that everyone recognized even if they couldn't name the piece. Elena's hand flew up the keyboard, and in that moment, she felt more alive than she had in 3 years. This wasn't careful Debussy anymore. This was bold, brash, unafraid. The guests recognized it immediately. She heard someone gasp in recognition, heard whispered conversations about whether she could actually pull this off. Rhapsody in Blue wasn't just technically difficult. It required personality, swagger, the kind of interpretive confidence that came from really understanding both classical technique and jazz sensibility. Elena had studied this piece intensively in her 3rd year at the conservatory. Her teacher, Professor Martinez, had assigned it specifically because Elena tended to play everything too carefully, too precisely. Music isn't just about hitting the right notes, he'd told her. Sometimes you need to take risks, bend the rules, let the piece breathe and live. She'd spent months with Rhapsody in Blue, learning not just how to play it, but how to inhabit it. And now, 3 years later, her fingers remembered not just the notes, but the attitude behind them. The piece required switching between different moods and textures, from classical to jazzy, from contemplative to celebratory. Her hands moved across the keys with increasing confidence, finding the groove, the swing, the feeling that made Gershwin sound like Gershwin. About 2 minutes in, Elena started improvising. It was subtle at first, small embellishments in the jazz sections, little departures from the written score that added her own voice to Gershwin's. This was something she'd always loved about this piece. It invited interpretation, encouraged the pianist to make it their own. She added some chromatic runs, threw in a few unexpected chord voicings, let the rhythm breathe in places where she felt it wanted to slow down. The improvisation grew bolder. Elena was in the zone again, but differently than with Debussy. This time she was aware of the audience, playing to them, with them, creating something that only existed in this moment and would never exist exactly this way again. She could feel the room's energy, and it fed her performance, made her braver. Halfway through, she glanced up briefly and caught sight of faces watching her. They weren't looking at a waitress anymore. They were looking at an artist. The distinction mattered more than she'd realized it would. For 3 years, people had looked through her past her around her. Now they were actually seeing her, and what they were seeing had nothing to do with the uniform she wore or the job she did. They were seeing her talent, her soul, the part of herself she'd had to bury to survive. Christine Henderson was still crying, but smiling through the tears. Her fiancé had his arm around her, both of them swaying slightly to the rhythm. Richard Henderson stood with his arms crossed, but his stern expression had transformed into something like pride, as if Elena's performance reflected well on him somehow, just by happening at his daughter's party. Elena pushed through the more challenging sections, passages that required her hands to leap across the keyboard, that demanded precision even while maintaining that loose, jazzy feel. There were moments where she stumbled slightly, where 3 years of not practicing showed itself. But she'd learned something important at the conservatory. Mistakes only matter if you let them. Professor Martinez used to say, "If you make a mistake with confidence, the audience thinks it was intentional." So when her fingers landed on a wrong note or when her timing wasn't quite perfect, Elena just kept going, incorporating the mistakes into the flow of the music. Most of the audience probably didn't even notice. They were hearing the overall effect, the emotional arc of the piece, not analyzing every individual note. The piece built toward its climactic ending, that triumphant, celebratory finish that always made Elena think of fireworks. Her hands flew across the keys, the music growing louder, bigger, more expansive. The Steinway responded beautifully, the sound filling every corner of the restaurant. She hit the final chord with everything she had, letting it ring out bold and clear. The applause was immediate and thunderous. People weren't just clapping anymore, they were cheering, whistling, calling out praise. Elena sat at the piano, breathing hard. Her hands still trembling slightly from the exertion, she felt like she'd just run a marathon, exhausted and exhilarated at the same time. She looked around and noticed something that made her heart skip. Several people had their phones out. Not just one or two, maybe a dozen guests were recording. Some had clearly started filming during the performance, their phones still held up, cameras pointed at her. The realization hit her like cold water. They'd recorded her playing. They'd captured this moment, and in today's world, that meant it could end up anywhere. That was absolutely incredible. Richard Henderson was walking toward the piano, practically beaming. Other guests crowded around, everyone wanting to talk to her at once. "Where did you say you studied? How long have you been playing? Do you perform professionally? Can we hire you for our events?" Elena felt overwhelmed by the sudden attention. 5 minutes ago, she'd been invisible. Now she was the center of everything. Mr. Castellano appeared at her side, his face flushed with excitement rather than stress for the first time all evening. "Elena, that was remarkable. I had no idea you had this talent. If I'd known, could you play one more?" Christine Henderson interrupted, her voice soft but hopeful. "Please, something else beautiful. This is my engagement party, and this music is making it perfect." Elena looked at the piano, at her hands, at the faces watching her with expectation and wonder. She was tired, emotionally drained from pouring 3 years of suppressed feeling into 2 performances. But she also felt something else, hungry. Hungry to keep playing, to make up for lost time, to remember what it felt like to be this version of herself. "One more," she agreed. The crowd applauded her decision and settled back to listen. Elena thought about what to play for the finale. Something that would complete the journey she'd started, that would honor the moment without trying to top what she'd just done. She thought about Christine, about engagement parties, about love and commitment and hope. She chose Chopin's Nocturne in E-flat major, Opus 9, No. 2. It was romantic without being sentimental, technically demanding but emotionally accessible. Her teacher at the conservatory had once told her that Chopin wrote music that sang like the human voice, and this nocturne exemplified that quality. As she began to play, Elena realized this performance felt different from the first 2. With Debussy, she'd been nervous, fighting through 3 years of silence. With Gershwin, she'd been bold, reclaiming her confidence. But with Chopin, she was simply present, not thinking about the past or worrying about the future, just existing in the moment with the music. The melody unfolded like a conversation, each phrase answering the previous one. Elena's fingers had finally fully remembered their training. The touch was sensitive, nuanced, creating the singing quality that made Chopin sound like Chopin. She paid attention to the inner voices, the harmonies supporting the melody, making sure every element of the music was clear and intentional. The room had gone completely silent again, but this silence felt different. It wasn't the shocked silence of people discovering unexpected talent. It was the reverent silence of people experiencing something genuinely moving, something that touched them deeper than entertainment or distraction. Elena played the final phrases slowly, letting each note carry its full weight of emotion. The last chord dissolved into stillness, and for several seconds nobody moved. Then the applause began again, but softer this time, more respectful. Some people were wiping their eyes. Christine Henderson approached the piano, her makeup slightly smeared from crying. She looked at Elena with an expression that was hard to read. Part gratitude, part something else. Regret maybe for the cruelty she'd shown earlier. "Thank you," Christine said simply. "You made my engagement party unforgettable. And I'm sorry, truly sorry for how I treated you before you played. That was unacceptable." Elena nodded, not quite sure how to respond to an apology from someone who'd been mocking her less than an hour ago. But Christine seemed genuine, her remorse real. Richard Henderson stepped forward with an envelope. "The $1,000 I promised, plus another $1,000 for those additional pieces. You've earned every penny. $2,000. Elena took the envelope with shaking hands, hardly believing it was real. $2,000 for doing what she loved, for playing music that had been locked inside her for 3 years. It felt like winning the lottery and graduating from the conservatory and every good thing all at once. But as she held that envelope, as the guests continued to congratulate her and ask questions, Elena felt something shifting inside her. Some door that had closed 3 years ago was beginning to open again. Just a crack letting light through. She'd thought her music career was over, that she'd made her choice and would have to live with it forever. Maybe that wasn't true. Maybe the story wasn't over yet. Mr. Castellano was talking about future events, about how the restaurant could use someone like her on a regular basis. Guests were exchanging business cards, talking about upcoming parties and benefits that needed entertainment. Miguel was grinning at her from across the room, giving her an enthusiastic thumbs up. Through it all, Elena kept looking at the piano, at the instrument that had given her back something she thought was lost forever. She didn't know what would happen next, didn't know how this night would change her life. She just knew that for the first time in 3 years, she felt like herself again, and that feeling was worth more than any amount of money. Elena went home that night with $2,000 in her purse and a feeling she couldn't quite name, buzzing through her entire body. Her mom was still awake when she got back to their small apartment, sitting on the couch watching one of her telenovelas with the volume low. "Mija, you're home late. How was the big party?" Elena sat down next to her mom and just started crying. Not sad tears, something else entirely. 3 years of holding everything together, of being strong, of sacrificing her dreams without complaint, all came pouring out. Her mom held her, confused but patient, waiting for an explanation. When Elena finally found words, she told her mom everything. About the drunk pianist, about the $1,000 offer, about sitting at the piano after 3 years and discovering that her hands still remembered. About the applause and the crying guests and the envelope full of money that would cover months of medication. "You played?" her mom whispered, tears starting in her own eyes. "You played piano again?" "I did. And Mom, it felt like coming home. Like I'd been holding my breath for 3 years and finally remembered how to breathe." They stayed up until 2 in the morning, talking, crying, laughing. Her mom kept saying she was proud, kept apologizing for the sacrifice Elena had made. Elena kept telling her it wasn't her fault, that she'd make the same choice 100 times over. But both of them understood that something had shifted tonight, that some door that seemed permanently closed had cracked open again. Elena didn't sleep much. She kept replaying the evening in her mind, feeling her fingers move through the pieces, hearing the applause echo in her memory. When she finally dozed off just before dawn, she dreamed of music like she always did. But this time the dreams felt different, not like memories of what she'd lost, but like premonitions of what might be possible. She had to work the lunch shift at La Scala the next day. Walking into the restaurant felt surreal, like returning to a place that should be familiar but had somehow transformed overnight. Mr. Castellano pulled her aside before service started. "Elena, I've had 5 calls this morning. 5 different guests from last night's party wanting to book you for their events. Plus the Hendersons want you to play at the actual wedding in 3 months." He looked bewildered. like he couldn't quite square the waitress he'd known for 3 years with the pianist who'd stunned his guests. I didn't know what to tell them. I mean, you work here, but also if you wanted to do some piano gigs on the side. Really? 5 people called? Actually, it's 7 now. 2 more just came in. Elena, I don't know what happened last night, but you've made quite an impression. The lunch shift was strange. Some of the regular customers had heard about the previous evening and looked at her differently. Word traveled fast in the wealthy circles that frequented La Scala. Elena felt exposed in a way she hadn't before, like she couldn't hide behind the invisibility of being a server anymore. Miguel cornered her by the coffee station. Dude, you're blowing up on social media. Have you seen? What? He pulled out his phone and showed her. One of the guests had posted a video on Instagram from the night before. Elena playing the ending of Rhapsody in Blue. The caption read, "When the waitress turns out to be a concert pianist. This is the most beautiful thing I've seen all year." The video had tens of thousands of views already and the comments were overwhelming. Who is she? This is insane. Why isn't she performing professionally? I literally have chills. Someone find this woman and give her a recording contract. Miguel scrolled through several other posts from different guests. They'd all filmed parts of her performance, all posted with amazed, emotional captions. The videos were spreading, being shared across platforms. Some had hundreds of thousands of views. Elena felt dizzy looking at the numbers. This is crazy. I don't even know what this is. It's you getting the recognition you deserve, Miguel said firmly, even if it's 3 years late. Over the next few days, the videos continued spreading. Someone created a compilation of all the different angles and performances from that night, and it went viral. Local news stations picked up the story. Hidden talent, waitress stuns party with concert-level performance. Then regional news. Then national morning shows started calling La Scala asking for interviews. Elena's life became a whirlwind. She kept working her shifts because she needed the money and didn't know what else to do. But increasingly, people recognized her. Customers asked for photos. Other servers treated her differently, with a mix of awe and distance that made her uncomfortable. The call that changed everything came on a Tuesday afternoon. Elena was on break eating a sandwich in the staff room when Mr. Castellano found her looking more shocked than she'd ever seen him. Elena, there's someone here to see you. She says her name is Catherine Chen. She says she's from the Steinway Foundation? Elena nearly choked on her sandwich. Catherine Chen was legendary in classical music circles. She ran one of the most prestigious foundations supporting young pianists, had connections to every major concert hall and record label, and was known for discovering talent and turning careers around. What would someone like that want with a waitress from La Scala? Catherine Chen was waiting in Mr. Castellano's office, an elegant woman in her 60s with silver hair and sharp, intelligent eyes. She stood when Elena entered and extended her hand. Elena Rivera, I've been looking for you. Please sit down. Elena sat feeling like she'd been pulled into some alternate reality. Catherine Chen in Mr. Castellano's cramped office, surrounded by delivery schedules and inventory lists, felt fundamentally wrong. I saw the videos of your performance, Catherine began without preamble. I've watched them probably 20 times now. I've been in this business for 40 years and I know real talent when I hear it. Your technique is remarkable, but it's more than that. You play with genuine emotional depth. That's rare, especially in someone so young. Thank you, Elena managed. I studied at Western Conservatory, but I had to leave before. I know, Catherine interrupted gently. I made some calls, spoke to your old professors. They told me about your mother's illness, about you leaving school. They also said you were one of the most gifted students they'd ever taught, and losing you was one of their greatest regrets. Elena felt tears threatening. She hadn't spoken to her professors in years, had been too ashamed to reach out after dropping out. Here's what I'd like to propose, Catherine continued. The Steinway Foundation has a program for exceptional talent who've faced unusual circumstances. We provide full scholarships to return to school, plus living expenses and support for family medical needs. I'd like to offer you a spot in the program. The words didn't make sense at first. Elena heard them but couldn't process their meaning. A scholarship? Living expenses? Support for her mom's medical needs? I don't understand. Why would you do this for me? Because talent like yours deserves to be nurtured, not buried. Because the classical music world needs artists who understand struggle and sacrifice, who have something real to say through their music. Because 40 years in this business has taught me to recognize the rare ones, and Elena, you're rare. Catherine pulled out a folder. This would allow you to return to Western Conservatory to finish your degree. The foundation would cover tuition, provide a monthly stipend, and arrange support for your mother's ongoing medical care. After graduation, we'd help you launch a professional career. Auditions, debut concerts, connections to the right people. Elena's hands were shaking. This can't be real. Things like this don't happen to people like me. They do when you're talented enough, Catherine said simply. The videos of your performance have been viewed millions of times now. Do you know what that means? You've already built an audience, already proven you can move people. Most classical musicians struggle for years to get that kind of attention. You did it in one night because what you have is undeniable. Over the next hour, Catherine laid out the details. The program would start in January, giving Elena time to prepare. She'd work with a coach over the coming months to regain her full technical level. The foundation would handle everything: finances, logistics, even helping her mom with the transition. I need you to understand something, Catherine said as they finished. This isn't charity. We don't give these opportunities to people we feel sorry for. We give them to artists we believe in. Artists we think can make a real contribution to classical music. The world needs to hear you play, Elena. All I'm doing is removing the obstacles that have been preventing that from happening. Elena walked out of that office in a daze. She went back to finish her shift because that's what you did. You finished your commitments, but her mind was somewhere else entirely. She kept touching her pocket where the folder sat, making sure it was real, that she hadn't imagined the entire conversation. When she got home that night, she sat her mom down and explained everything. Her mom cried harder than Elena had ever seen, kept saying Dios mío over and over, kept hugging Elena so tight she could barely breathe. You're going back, her mom said. You're going to finish school. You're going to be the pianist you were always meant to be. We're going to be okay, Elena said. Both of us. For the first time in 3 years, we're actually going to be okay. The next few months passed in a blur. Elena gave her notice at La Scala, finishing out her final shifts to a mix of celebration and sadness. She'd worked there for 3 years, and despite everything, it had been a safe harbor when she'd needed one. Mr. Castellano threw her a going-away party, and even some of the regular customers she'd served hundreds of times came to wish her well. Christine Henderson sent flowers with a note. Thank you for saving my engagement party, and for teaching me an important lesson about judging people. I'll be at your debut concert cheering louder than anyone. Elena spent her days working with the coach Catherine had arranged, rebuilding her technique, expanding her repertoire, preparing to return to the conservatory. Her hands strengthened, her skills sharpened, and slowly, the pianist she'd been 3 years ago re-emerged, but different now. Better maybe. More mature. With more to say, she returned to Western Conservatory in January. Walking back through those familiar halls felt like time travel. Like she'd stepped into a life that had been waiting for her to come back. Some of her old classmates were still there, finishing graduate programs, and their reactions ranged from shock to joy. Her professors welcomed her back with genuine warmth, telling her they'd never doubted she'd find her way back to music. The work was intense. Elena had to make up for 3 lost years while also pushing forward with new material. She practiced 6, 7, sometimes 8 hours a day, her hands aching but happy. Every time she sat at the piano, she thought about that night at La Scala, about choosing to play despite her fear, about the door that had opened because she'd been brave enough to walk through it. 6 months later, Elena performed her debut concert at the Henderson Center for the Arts, a venue funded, coincidentally, by the same family whose party had changed her life. The hall was sold out. Catherine Chen sat in the front row next to Elena's mom, who wore a new dress and couldn't stop smiling. Miguel came with half the staff from La Scala. Even Mr. Castellano was there looking proud.